At the debate, the candidates sparred over key issues like inflation, immigration, and abortion. Here to break it all down for us is Mike Leon and Nick Zaveri. They are hosts of the news commentary podcast, Can We Please Talk? Mike is also the policy and strategy director of the Free and Equal Elections Foundation. Nick is a Democratic strategist who has worked on a number of Democratic campaigns. Mike, did the debate change the dynamics of this race in any way?
Well, first, Chris, good to see you first and foremost. Good to see my co-host on here as well. Hey, everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Zaveri.
Happy holidays, everybody. Our year-ender episode is here. If you're watching us on YouTube, thank you. You can see Santa over my right shoulder and the reindeers as well. Nick Zaveri's here. We can't thank each and every one of you for listening to this program throughout the year. So Nick and I, we're going to be on our usual break over the next week or so, unless the world is set on fire, Nick, over the next week, and we'll hop back on to do an episode. But the government shutdown was avoided, so I think we've avoided everything. Elon Musk is influencing U.S. Congress. President-elect Trump is playing golf. President Biden's nowhere to be found. We'll figure all of that stuff out in the new year. But first, we're going to reflect back on the year that was in this special episode, as we like to do all the times around the holidays. You just heard before we came on something that's near and dear to Nick and I in terms of the growth of this show, and that's Nick and I have been on TV more. Nick and I have been doing more appearances and doing what we kind of set out to do when we started this show a while back, which was have our voices be heard, add to the discourse. At worst, we leave our little girls something to listen to. So, Nick, I say hello to you first and foremost, but tell me a little bit about 2024 going into 2025. How have you felt about the year so far? We're gonna maybe we'll do a little lump of coal. Who gets a lump of coal and who doesn't? But how has 2024 for you and for this show been?
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, it's been just a year of change, a year of loss too, losing a friend, a couple of friends actually at the earlier part of the year, and then, changing careers. So 2024 has just been this interesting mix of highs and lows. In terms of, where I am, obviously, I mean, I feel in a great place, the work I'm doing at, the university and the family's doing well. But I think in terms of the American landscape, I think we're just living in an age where, the lump of coal you're hinting at, I think it really goes to Democrats and liberals. I think what this recent election told us was America's just done. The voters are not, and it's not even, I mean, both, popular vote, electoral vote. America doesn't want to hear, they don't want to hear complaining. They want to be perceived, at least, as coming from a place of strength. Obviously, we're going to talk more about this, throughout this episode. But yeah, the thing I've been thinking a lot lately between our show, obviously I mentioned Rick's show, on the education show we have here at the network. But what keeps coming up is this idea of, what have we missed? What is getting more brought to light in light of November 5th. And I'm excited to sort of reflect on that. And that's where I've been right now, just questioning a lot of things and really being in many ways annoyed with, really left-leaning movements and just the tone deafness of Democrats, post-election. It just seems to be a really, I think the momentum of 2020, I think progressivism, I think in many ways feminism, I think really just kind of ends this year, 4 years removed, with just a whimper. And I think that's where the conversation begins.
It's funny that you said some of those things, because when we started this show, you and I, and this, like we talked about doing something together, right? Obviously rekindling our friendship, not that we stopped talking, but then also like talking about issues, right? At the core of this was always to talk about issues. Now, a lot of it has been centered around news. and politics, obviously. And we've been fortunate enough to get journalists, correspondents on the show, people that cover this stuff. We're going to get into some of the folks that have been on the show and some of our favorite interviews from this past year. But I think for me in 2024, and it started with the beginning of the show, you and I on a national network examining the presidential debate that happened. And I think that to me signifies first and foremost a personal growth that you and I have had 4 years of doing this, that people have recognized our commentary. People have agreed with us, disagreed with us. If you go to our TikTok channel and just look at some of the comments towards Nick and I, you'll see the disagreement. If you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see the same disagreement, but at least you see people adding to the discourse. And when we get the comments back, a lot of the times is a pushback on a position or a stat. It's never about the take itself. And I think for me, that's the biggest thing for what we wanted to do with this show when we started Can We Please Talk, was really about talking. And the second part, which is not marketable, listening. And I think we've done that. Now, to your overall point about what you said about the country, I over the last couple of weeks, months, I don't know what it is. I think, and especially with Rick Sanchez's show now launching on our network, you can go check out that show, Journalistically Speaking, with Rick Sanchez. I think I've started to come to this realization now that the election has told us that people don't want certain things. The way we talk about certain things, the delicacy that, or the butt hurt, for lack of a better term, ways that people get around certain things. I think that is what has really, 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 truly set people off and said to them, hey, I'm going to vote for the other guy. I want to go back to like where, whatever his economic policy was, maybe I don't know it or stuff like that. But I remember pre-pandemic, there was a certain feeling in the country. I don't know if I agree with that. We're going to find out from 25 and beyond if this is going to come to fruition and what people voted for is what they're going to get. We're going to find all of that out. But I do think that with our show, it's been more imperative. We're going to get to in a second, too, misinformation and disinformation and why Nick and I want to continue doing the show. But I think the through line for me has been not only our growth, but the fact that we're adding to the discourse and we're pretty integral to the discourse. And it funnels in perfectly for us, Nick, because the first thing that I think about this year is podcast. You and I are doing a podcast. Over 100 million Americans listen to one podcast every week. And if they listen to one of ours, thank you. We'd love to get more people listening to ours. But, 34% of Americans age 12 plus listen to at least one podcast a week. And so there's so many podcasts out there. And what you and I saw, Nick, this election cycle was really the way the campaigns use said podcast, going on non-traditional podcasts, talking about issues, but also talking about what you just said and what I just said, which is the way we feel and showcasing a little bit of our emotions and humanness. And we saw that work really well for Donald Trump, the new president-elect. And we saw some of that work negatively for Kamala Harris in some of these interviews. And people pointed to some of these interviews and said, I didn't see a person in there, or this person actually won me over based off of a podcast. And I got asked about that on a news segment because you and I started this show 4 years ago with that very intention of not only adding to the discourse, but maybe we could change somebody's mind.
So, gentlemen, once upon a time, there were 3 major TV networks and a daily newspaper cycle. Now media is created in real time by every citizen with a phone in their pocket and podcasters who operate rogue, answering only to themselves. How have the candidates attempted to deliver their message to the masses amidst this new unconventional media environment? Let's jump over to let's start with you again.
Well, first, I was a former producer for one of those networks, so let's start there. I think my podcast is a little bit different. Can We Please Talk? Go download new episodes every Monday. But I started it differently because I came at it from a producer lens and able to secure interviews with members of Congress, journalists and correspondents like you guys, and analysts, experts that can talk about foreign policy and military affairs. I think the candidates have used it really advantageously. Look, there's about maybe 3 to 6 million people that watch linear traditional cable news. Joe Rogan gets 11 million downloads a month. where are you going to go to do an interview? And I think for Kamala Harris this cycle, Call Her Daddy is a popular female podcast formerly on Barstool Sports. She went there, millions of followers, millions of downloads. She recently went on Shannon Sharp's podcast, Club Shay Shay, All the Smoke podcast, which is an NBA podcast with Steven Jackson and Matt Barnes. They're using it in non-conventional ways. And I think what has come out of this cycle, at least the through line for me, has been it's humanizing some of these folks. I've heard people in the golf industry where I formerly worked in talk about Bryson DeChambeau's video with former President Trump and how they felt like it humanized him, right? So then when Democrats run the messaging around democracy and he's a threat to democracy, but here he is playing golf with a popular golfer who's won the US Open twice, it doesn't jive, right? Which is why I told Democrats message in a different way. But it's been interesting to see because without that podcast and me starting it back in October of 2020, I'm not here right now potentially talking. And I think it's allowed folks to be able to get their voice out. But I would hope that people do it a little bit more structurally with a background in a journalism major from Rutgers University like I have.
And before we go over to Darren, I just want to ask as a podcaster, if you compare the format to the constricted nature of linear TV and news programs, how have both candidates specifically been able to use that format in a way that maybe we've never seen in an election cycle?
You brought up a great point because the runtime of the Trump interview with Rogan is 2 hours and 58 minutes. You just rolled your eyes. I would roll my eyes as well too because I can't listen to 3 hours of long form content, but there's an audience for it. And the one thing in the podcast space, I look at analytics, right? The sweet spot's always about a 45-minute episode because people are working out at the gym or they're commuting to work, so they're able to listen to a podcast at least over 78% through. When you do 3 hours, that means they have to break it up. But back to the overarching point, Carrie, is that go do long form, go do an interview with CNN, go do a 10-second, a 10-minute hit on NPR because there's an audience for all three.
Yeah, I think and it's interesting because you and I have had that conversation about, traditional news media, other outlets that people may be going to, and that clip you played, I think just speaks to it. I'm excited because we had this conversation on the show. You and I had a back and forth about where candidates should be going, and at the time, we're specifically talking about Vice President Harris. Yeah, those are interesting. There was an interesting clip recently from Mallory McMorrow, who's a Michigan state senator. And she had said the same thing about Democrats, about going on shows like Joe Rogan's and going on other shows and just talking, talk about, who we are, the issues. The one thing we constantly bang on the former president, who's now obviously coming back, and Donald Trump, is there's no clear policy vision. And we can keep saying that till we're, democratically blue in the face, and it doesn't matter because America is smoking and policies are not what is driving this conversation. It's the pursuit of trying to bring back some form of America from the past, in an America where we don't focus as much, at least for voters, on matters of race, on matters of gender. It's more about the economy. I mean, that's kind of what that really landed on me as. But we had this and we, in the spirit of talking about November 5th in the election, one of the things that came up for me was the postmortem that we did with Marie Harf of Fox News, who's just a dear friend to the show, right? And we went into and just had Marie talk about where the party is failing, and the common thread about what we say on television, what we say on podcast, messaging was something that kept coming up, and Marie broke it down really well.
I'm curious about this because I get the sense that there is a separation between the ideas of the party versus the faces of it right now.
No, it's a great question. I think I would flip the question a little bit. I don't know that it's our messenger, although I do think there's a lot of people who don't want to vote for a woman for president. I'm sorry, I will say it. I think that Trump is singular in many ways. It was their messenger. Tens of thousands of people in Arizona and Nevada voted for Donald Trump and then didn't vote for anyone else. They didn't vote for the Senate. They didn't vote any. They just voted for Trump. Tens of thousands of voters, right? That's a lot. I think it's partly the message. I think the Biden team did an extraordinarily poor job of messaging how good the economy is. Because for a long time, they told people it wasn't that bad and inflation was transitory. And like people were feeling it in their pocketbooks, but they were saying, oh, it's better than the rest of the world. That's true, but that's not like a great political argument, right? So I think the Biden team did a horrific job at messaging on the economy. And I think Biden never should have run. And I think Kamala should have had more than 13 weeks to be the candidate. But so I think it's the message. And I think it's partly the messenger, but I think that Trump is such a cultural phenomenon. He is this like masculine id that tapped into something in this country, and he's promising all these things economically. You know, we fight with 10-point plans about housing, and he says, I'm just not going to tax tips anymore. So I think that a lot of people just Trump tapped into this anti-incumbent, post-pandemic, post-inflation, global trend that's like, throw them all out. And Kamala couldn't run as a popular incumbent because the Biden administration is not that popular, and she couldn't run as an outsider. And so I think we have to figure out how to take those ideas that people like and help the middle class, the working class, right? And figure out who the right messenger is and what the right message is.
Yeah, Marie is great, and funny enough, we're going to play a clip in a second that talks about the comment section in social media, but we were talking about our comment section on TikTok and YouTube. Go follow Marie Harf, folks. She's on Instagram, she's on Blue Sky. But if you follow Fox News's Instagram, and Nick, you know this, whenever Marie is about to go on, and she goes on Outnumbered a lot, which is a show that airs during the day, the comment section are brutal to her, and I don't know why. I know why, because she's a Democrat, but I don't know why, because when you listen to her commentary, as you just heard in that clip, she's very honest about being introspective and looking at certain things, right? Like, because she's a former campaign manager. She was a former advisor to the Secretary of State who would go and meet with foreign dignitaries, who has to go communicate with people that maybe are adversaries, maybe are partners. So she also was a State Department spokesperson, right? So she's been in front of, the pulpit and answering questions from reporters wanting to know, why is this war continuing? Why did Russia annex Crimea? And why didn't you guys do anything about it? And so like, she has all of that background and knowledge. And then she goes on TV, and then she comes on podcasts, thankfully enough for being a friend of the show here, and articulates. And for some reason, she continues to get hammered. Again, I get it, because she's a Democrat, she gets that ire. But when you hear her talk, it is true. Like, you can hear that she didn't expect this to happen, but now it's okay, how do we get up off the mat and go out there and regroup and figure out the future of this? But we have to, first and foremost, listen to the people who are telling you about it throughout the days and weeks and months leading up. And the second thing we have to do is, and it funnels into my clip here of something that I loved when you were away on vacation, Nick. I had Lauren Villagrán on the show, the USA Today reporter, who covers a lot of immigration issues. She's based down in El Paso, Texas. So she's down there at the border. But she wrote this article, and the USA Today did a series about hope. There's 19 towns in America called Hope, like Hope, Texas, Hope, New York, I think. And they interviewed people from those things talking prior to the election. So they did like this election series about, hope and the prospective election coming up. But then she wrote an article about combating misinformation and disinformation, and the delineation between misinformation and what disinformation is, right? Misinformation, not getting a stat right or something like that. You have to correct yourself from that, issue a correction. Disinformation, purposely misleading people, which is what other commentary shows do. Nick and I don't have those intentions, because if we did, we throw the hats on right now and we'd be getting flooded with sponsorships and stuff like that. We don't got time for that. Like, I don't have time for that. I'm not going to throw on, as I've said numerous times, and I'll say it again, even though I have a black t-shirt on right now, for those of us watching on YouTube, I'm not going to throw on a black t-shirt and jeans and go watch a movie, a Barbie movie, and tell you how woke it is, and then we're going to upload it to YouTube later. I don't have time for that. I know that's going to get 6 million views, and that's going to make that person money, Ben Shapiro, but I don't have time for that. Like, that's not what Nick and I want to do. What Nick and I want to do is continue to add to the discourse with realism and with correspondents, journalists, members of Congress, newsmakers that are actually making the news, covering the news, and giving you important information. And when we had Lauren on the show, it made me realize that we got to keep going, Nick. Like, this show has to continue because we need to continue to not only talk about these issues, but we need to learn more about these issues. And I thought Lauren did a great job of really identifying and explaining misinformation and disinformation, and really how to talk to your family. But you wrote this great piece that I encourage people to go check out over at USA Today about how to talk to family members when they bring up misinformation and disinformation. Okay, so Lauren, you're the subject matter expert. Tell me how to talk to my family.
Yeah, well, the very first thing is don't laugh at them or ridicule them or belittle them or start with sarcasm. It's not going to go well. I think the first thing that I learned in writing this piece is that there are real important reasons why people accept, believe, and then spread conspiracy theories, right? And it's not because they're terrible people, okay? I think to start with the beginning of your question, politics is politics, and politicians are always going to tell half-truths. And it's really, I think, an important function of journalism to do that fact-checking that you mentioned. That being said, disinformation is different from misinformation, right? So disinformation is really creating, I mean, we can just call it what it is, like a lie to use for political ends. And I think the story about migrants eating household pets is a perfect example of that. And it does extreme harm because it obscures the very real challenges that, for example, a community like Springfield, Ohio is facing with a large number of newcomers in their community who don't speak English. And we can talk about that in a minute. But when you're dealing with someone who has bought hook, line, and sinker into a conspiracy, a great place to start is by asking open-ended questions. Hey, where did you hear that information? What are your sources for that information? You've been doing some research. Tell me a little bit more about that. And really try to get an understanding of where it came from. Unfortunately, and this was very sad to me, especially as a journalist who peddles in facts, that research shows that it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to get somebody to let a conspiracy theory go. And part of the reason for that is that either they're using it to make sense of their world, and even if it seems a little off, a little maybe even crazy, it's helped them make sense of something in their world that was provoking anxiety or loss of control. What was a bright spot and what I learned about folks who believe in conspiracy theories and how you should speak to your loved ones about them is that you can actually inoculate another person against believing in future conspiracy theories or false narratives by, again, with time, respect, and patience, and a healthy dose of empathy, working with that person to show them how to recognize false narratives, how to recognize when an information source is trustworthy. Now, I think this is especially difficult in a presidential election year. I think it's especially difficult when you have is one of the candidates in particular unwilling to walk back information when it has been debunked, and even when it's doing harm in a community. I mean, I think that can be incredibly difficult because for people who support former President Trump and his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, they haven't given up on what they're saying. But as I told the many, many readers who wrote me and said they believed in the conspiracy, so that article wasn't for them, it's for their loved ones. I just wrote back and I said, this is a developing story and no facts have emerged, no evidence has emerged of any migrant doing harm to a household pet or consuming a household pet.
Yeah, I struggle a little bit with what Lauren said.
We all do. We all do.
I've certainly had my moments, less so now with my mother-in-law, but we've certainly had our verbal throwdowns in the past, and I've had my moments with family members and other folks that I'm not tolerant of it. I mean, I'm trying to be more understanding and willing to have someone at least sort of play through their viewpoint with me. But there is a time when you're gonna just utter foolishness, and I think about the folks like Alex Jones, and I think about even Aaron Rodgers now. And I have no patience for that, because to me that is intentional. And that's the word here. If I look at members of my family or friends and assume they're sheep and they're being easily led, and I'm supposed to feel a sort of level of sympathy, I don't. I don't, because they're intelligent people. I don't really associate with them. And fortunately, I'm not related to stupid people. So if you are going to parrot those talking points, rightfully, I'm going to call you on your nonsense, as I would expect someone to do of me as well. But I do think she raised a good point about, at least offering strategies that for people to learn how to engage. And that's certainly true with younger viewers above of this show, younger voters. And we had a lot of folks coming out for the first time voting in this election who, there's a lot of conversations to be had about what information led them to voting the way they did. We had many young voters, young men, that came out and said that they felt that masculinity was threatened. Others would say, well, they felt the economy was better under Trump and all these things. And I'm not going to sit here and debate all that, but first, I'll just applaud that they went to the polls. But this conversation came up, and we had on another friend of the show, and Sabrina Rodriguez, who was out in these streets, as they like to say, talking to young voters, and just got a lot of really good insights from what was their mindset going into voting in the upcoming election.
Absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I've lost count. It's not even like I can say, oh, a couple people. No, I mean, so many people that I've talked to, and my colleagues and I discuss it too. I mean, one of my colleagues who you should all read her work, Dylan Wells, she also focuses a lot on young voters on the campaign trail. And she's been on a lot of college campuses before school is out. I'm just talking to folks about the issues driving them in this election. And what we've heard consistently is the situation in Gaza. Is the death toll in Gaza, is the U.S.'s involvement and the U.S.'s relationship with Israel. That has come up consistently. I mean, many of us have seen the headlines of the protests on college campuses, and again, the headlines around the death toll that is taking place at this time. And that does come up for a lot of people. A lot of people that were, and again, and it's not a binary choice for a lot of people, which I think is hard for many people to conceptualize, given that we have this two-party system. It's a lot of, oh, well, if you don't vote for Joe Biden, well, then you're going to let Donald Trump win. But for a lot of young voters that I've spoken to, well, they're saying, like, I'm not trying to partake in the lesser of two evils. Like, if the lesser of two evils is someone that is co-signing what is happening in Gaza, or is allowing or facilitating for that to happen, I don't want to participate, and I don't want to vote for that person. And that is something that I've heard a lot of young college students saying, that they just don't like what they're seeing. And really, I mean, even if you just look at, the comments section, if you go on TikTok and you see like like any kind of video that comes up about Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, oftentimes the comment section, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with that, it could be like a Pride Month video. It could be, them ahead of Juneteenth, anything that comes up, the comment section is always filled with people criticizing them over this specific issue.
What I love about this show, Nick and Sabrina, you mentioned friend of the pod, Marie Harf, we mentioned friend of the pod, Lauren Villagrán, friend of the pod, right? And it's been those three ladies right there, right? Two journalists, one based, on a border state in El Paso, in a border town. Another one that has covered national politics for a couple of national outlets in Politico and Washington Post. Another one who has worked in the government, like I mentioned, at the State Department. She was a CIA officer. She's done so many different things, run campaigns, been part of, a super PAC with during the Obama days and the reelection campaign. So like you get three different types of voices and three different types of subject matter experts, and specifically two journalists that, like you said, they're in these streets, they're out there doing the work. And You know, what's funny about when I talked to her about that, and again, obviously that was all pre-election stuff, and she had mentioned the clip that I had played for her before she answered was around a young voter talking about the war in Gaza. And you know, we've been talking about this episode, you know, the issues that came up for voters and how President-elect Trump came back, the economy, right? But a big thing was the war in Gaza. Like, let's be honest, October 7th upended a lot of things for a lot of people between the Jewish diaspora that's not only here in the US, but around the world. And then the Palestinian diaspora that's here in the US. And we saw that felt in Michigan, obviously by Vice President Kamala Harris not being able to get some of the votes there. We saw the mayor of Michigan, you know, being very vocal, Jill Stein doing some things with Palestinian voters there, trying to get votes away from Kamala Harris. And that was something that was top of mind for a lot of folks. And I get it. Nick and I have done, if you look back at our show and you go to our YouTube channel, you can see like the different topics that Nick and I have done and how many episodes we've done on it or segments. And Israel, Palestine, and I hate calling it the conflict, but that friction between these two and the ability to not have a two-state solution in that region, right? And all the vitriol that's aimed at Hamas, at Bibi Netanyahu, and what happened on October 7th, and the horror that took place in those kibbutzes, and then juxtapose that from what has happened with over close to 50,000 people in Gaza dying, and now the attacks that have happened in Lebanon with you know Hezbollah, between Hezbollah and Israel and the IDF, and so just so much from all of that, and so many different feelings and emotions. And the thing that I love about this show has been when Nick and I and our bookers send out a note, hey, we want to talk to somebody about this. They know who the people are that are interviewing. They know the intentionality behind it. And we had Dov Waxman, who's very prominent professor. I recommend highly you follow him on Twitter. He wrote a book about the Israel-Palestine conflict, but he's the UCLA professor of Israel studies. Again, prominent university, has done a lot of public speaking appearances about this. British man. And I think he's greatly intellectual, but I think he also worded things that danced delicately between understanding this conflict, not shouldering or not placing blame, evenly distributing blame, and explaining how we can go forward from here.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to try to reduce as much as possible human suffering and the violence. I mean, peace, of course, I would love to see peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and I believe that is possible in the long run. But right now, I think the more immediate concern is to prevent human suffering, and there's no doubt that Palestinian civilians in Gaza have been suffering greatly for many, many years now. And unfortunately and tragically, their suffering only comes to the attention of the international community and of world leaders when violence happens. It seems that when there's no violence, people forget about the suffering of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, who have indeed, as you just heard, been living for now 16 years under a Israeli blockade, which Egypt also maintains, of the Gaza Strip, a blockade which has prevented many goods from entering the country. It's really basically paralyzed Gaza's economy. It's produced a humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip, and that's been going on for years. And it's been largely ignored, and that is something that I think we can condemn. Certainly, successive Israeli governments for maintaining this blockade, even though it's really, I think, not served Israel's interest and has done great harm to Palestinian civilians. It's also Hamas who deserves to be condemned for this, as well as other countries like Egypt and indeed the United States, which has really not done very much to try to end the suffering of Gazans. I think first, and so what will hopefully, I hope, if anything good possibly can come out of this, I'm not very optimistic, but it would be that we can actually try to change the situation in Gaza, not just go back to the status quo ante, not just end the violence and let the situation continue where a repressive, violent regime such as Hamas rules over the Gaza Strip while Palestinian civilians are imprisoned there. unable to lead their lives, unable to find jobs, unable to feed themselves. Many are dependent upon international assistance, food assistance, simply to live. So we can't go back to that. The situation last week, before that terrorist attack took place, was absolutely unacceptable. I think we can condemn that, and we can condemn the policies of Israeli governments that produced that situation, just as we should also condemn Hamas policies.
Yeah, I particularly like that interview with Professor Waxman because it speaks to what you and I have talked about subject matter experts. It's funny too because there are certainly people in circles that you and I run with that we could have an entire panel, the preeminent experts on matters of the Middle East, particularly in that part of the world, that if they don't hear the viewpoint they subscribe to, will just denigrate and write off that said panel. So, one thing we continue to have to address in this country is the need that some folks have for an echo chamber, that if what's said back to them isn't what they believe, they write it off. We talk about that often on really both sides of the political spectrum these days. And that's, I think it kind of contributes to the why of this show, trying to combat that. But it's also a reality that I think that will continue to perpetuate, not just in the United States, I think all over the world. I think social media in some ways has caused that problem. That said, talking about a conflict in a part of the world that has been there for decades. Something we also have been able to do on this show is to also come up with a way to look ahead. This year, I believe last year too, we've had on some really young and inspiring members of Congress. We've had on Jasmine Crockett, Texas. We've had on Seth Moulton, Massachusetts, currently maligned. Seth Moulton and Mike and I have certainly had our feelings felt about the really those in bad faith who are questioning the representative's motivations in his recent comments, and I'll leave it there. But someone that came across the pathway of CWPT recently was Congressman Pat Ryan, of where my co-host's home district is. Growing up in that part of New York, and I love, politics aside for a second, I love these younger voices, these newer voices that we're seeing in Congress. And we haven't had many, I don't think we've had any actually, newer Republicans, that are coming on. And maybe hopefully we'll get some this coming year and, going forward. But we've had some really stellar people on the Democratic Party. And say what you want about Jamal Bowman, but when we had him on and some of the things he pushed forward, again, a former educator, I respect the hell out of that. But on the subject of, Congressman Pat Ryan, the congressman is a veteran, similar to Congressman Moulton, won his election by an even larger margin than his previous race. And when Pat was on with us, he talked about how do you reconcile a growing lead that he's developed now, further entrenched as the representative of his district, with a country that overall leans in a different direction toward the president. But at the same time, the congressman also talked about how do you really meaningfully combat, what the Republican talking points are in a reasoned way that goes to what Lauren was talking about earlier, about having an informed debate and not rolling the eyes and being sarcastic, but trying to have a meaningful conversation with someone that you don't necessarily agree with. Congressman, just to go off of the increase in numbers of your margin of victory, that's an anomaly considering where the party generally ended up on November 5th. What do you think? And you talked about this too, about those who voted for, the returning president, Donald Trump. And for you, what seems to be the through line between your success, those who chose to return back to, Donald Trump returned to the White House? Where's the connection? I'm not trying to obviously say there's anything remotely connecting you and the former president, but clearly there's a message that you both are putting out that's resonating with voters in your district.
Yeah, I think it's like there's like I've said it this way a few times, there's a substance and a style component to it, and both matter. I mean, I think on the substance of the less like some wonky policy, but more the substance for us was we centered this affordability crisis that everywhere in the country, but especially in the Hudson Valley. I mean, it's really, really bad, especially housing costs, whether you're a young person trying to rent, start somebody at my stage with young kids trying to buy a home, which is basically impossible, or you're a senior kind of priced out as you're on fixed income. Everybody, 80-90% of people are struggling with housing affordability as an example of this. And we just haven't done really anything to materially lower those costs for folks. So centering affordability on housing, healthcare, gas, groceries, utilities was really important. And then, I think one of the things stylistically I did in common with the president-elect and other good, I had a lot of other House colleagues do really well in other places too. It's certainly not anything we did alone, but campaigns are about like storytelling, right? And convincing people to trust you is about telling them a story about where you want to take things and where we are. And if you think about good stories, they have heroes and villains, right? And in Trump's story, the villains, like we all know the long list of the villains that he talks about, and the divisive and kind of demonizing way he does it. And in his story, the hero is him. Like he is the authoritarian only person who can fix everybody's problems. To me, the story we need to tell and that we tried to tell in our campaign, we did call out villains. Like we called out our local utility, Central Hudson. I don't know if you ever had to deal with these guys when you were hanging out in Poughkeepsie, but local utility monopoly screwed over thousands of people in the district. I'll spare you the long story, but we showed our willingness to name names and name villains and take them on and actually win and help people. And so naming the villains and then centering like people, the American people, in my case, my constituents, as the heroes. Like working people are the heroes, small business owners are the heroes, entrepreneurs, people starting companies, people starting podcasts, like people that are scrappy and hungry that go back to the founding patriotic roots of this country, centering that as, those folks as the hero. I think that's the need and opportunity space we have here to contrast with Trump and the MAGA movement.
Congressman Pat Ryan was great, man. Again, as you were saying before, somebody around our age demo, obviously from a district that I lived in once upon a time, but also some of his ideas, right? And figuring out how we kind of move a little bit more to this center. I think there are more Democratic voices that are like that. You were mentioning Republican voices. We have reached out to a few that we're going to have in the new year. Obviously, we're not going to have anybody on around the holiday break unless something massive breaks, but I'm appreciative of not only the members of Congress that come on this program, but the reporters and journalists that come on from the different outlets, the different subject matter experts that we've had, from Marie Harf to Pete Lapp and the recent, Luigi Mangione arrest and stuff like that. All of the different people that have been on this show, we can't do it without each and every one of them that comes on this program, that lends their voice to this program. We're so appreciative of it. And I'm so appreciative of me and my co-host starting this podcast 4 years ago now and really trying to add to the public discourse and just kind of cutting through the noise, because the television segments are too short and some people are doing 3-hour episodes. We ain't got time for that. And there's that sweet spot right in the middle. And that's where Can We Please Talk is. So we thank each and every one of you this holiday season for tuning into this program, downloading this program, subscribing to this program. Tell your friends and family about this program. Leave us comments. Follow us Instagram, Twitter, TikTok at Can We Please Talk podcast, on Twitter at Can We Please Talk. Do us a favor, leave comments in the iTunes section, wherever you get your pods. If you listen on Spotify, you can leave comments as well on there. And as Nick loves to say on the education show, I'll bring it over here. Can we please talk podcast at gmail.com. You want to email us, you want to talk to us, get something off your chest. Tell us how you're feeling going into 2025. We'd love to hear from you. We wish all of you a happy and a safe 2025 as we head into the new year. Happy holidays to everybody. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
Wishing you all a great holiday and just a safe start of the upcoming year and a prosperous 2025. I'm Nick Severi.
That's right. We'll see everybody next time.